Hey, welcome to Crime Time 911. Imagine this. It's the late 1980s. The world feels different. No smartphones, no social media, no instant GPS to guide you. Just maps, payphones, and handwritten notes. That's the backdrop for Tanya van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook, a young Canadian couple from British Columbia. Tanya was just 18 and Jay was 20. They were in that exciting stage of life where everything feels wide open. New love, new adventures, and the thrill of independence. On November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay set out on what should have been a simple overnight trip. Their plan? Drive down to Seattle in Jay's father's bronze Ford van to pick up furnace parts for the family business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. And for them, it was also a chance to spend time together on the road. But here's where the story takes a turn. Tanya and Jay never made it back home. Their families waited, worried, and eventually reported them missing. Days later, their van was found abandoned. And then, in separate locations, Tanya and Jay were discovered. Gone far too soon. For decades, this case haunted both sides of the border. Families, investigators, and entire communities left with questions and no answers. Leads dried up, and the case went cold. Fast forward more than 30 years, technology had changed. DNA science had advanced in ways that no one could have imagined back in the 80s. And suddenly, this case, once frozen in time, was cracked wide open. That's what makes a story so compelling. It's not just about tragedy, it's about persistence, science, and the way innovation can finally bring clarity to mysteries that seemed unsolvable. In this episode, we're going to walk through the journey, who Tanya and Jay were, what happened during their trip, how investigators struggled for decades, and ultimately, how DNA genealogy, yes, the same kind of testing people use to find long-lost relatives, helped identify the person responsible. And we'll do it in a way that feels like we're sitting down together, piecing it all out, step by step. Before we get into the twists and turns of the investigation, let's pause and talk about Tanya and Jay as people. Because when you hear about cases like this, it's easy to get lost in the headlines, the timelines, and the science. But at the heart of it all are two young lives that mattered deeply. Tanya van Cuylenborg, and I apologize if I'm not saying her last name correctly, was 18 years old. She grew up in Saanich, British Columbia, and was described by friends and family as kind, thoughtful, and adventurous. She had this quiet confidence about her, someone who didn't need to be the loudest in the room to leave an impression. Tanya loved photography, and she had a creative streak that made her stand out. Jay Cook, who was 20 years old, was from the same area. He was known as dependable, hardworking, and gentle. Jay had a strong bond with his family, especially his father, who trusted him enough to lend him the van for the trip. He was the kind of person people leaned on, the steady presence you could count on. Together, Tanya and Jay were a young couple just beginning to carve out their place in the world. They weren't chasing fame or fortune, they were simply living their lives, enjoying each other's company, and planning for the future. That's what makes their story resonate. They could have been anyone's friends, siblings, or neighbors. Their trip to Seattle wasn't supposed to be remarkable. It was just a routine errand. But it became the start of a mystery that would stretch across decades. On November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay left Victoria, British Columbia, and took the ferry to Port Angeles, Washington. From there, they planned to drive to Seattle to pick up furnace parts for Jay's father's business. The van they were driving was distinctive, a bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon. It was practical, roomy, and perfect for hauling parts. They carried cash for expenses, a sleeping bag, and Tanya's camera. But somewhere along the way, things went off course. The couple never returned home. Their families grew worried when they didn't hear from them, and soon the search began. Over the next several days, pieces of the puzzle began to surface. The van was found abandoned in Bellingham, Washington. Inside were Tanya's belongings, including her wallet and ID. Investigators knew something was wrong. Then, in separate locations, Tanya and Jay were found. Their lives had ended abruptly, and investigators were left with more questions than answers. The case ultimately drew attention on both sides of the border. Canadian and American authorities worked together, but despite their efforts, leads were scarce. Witnesses were limited, and forensic technology in the late 80s was nowhere near what it is today. For Tanya and Jay's families, the waiting was unbearable. Days turned into months, months into years, and eventually decades. Every anniversary brought renewed pain. Every new lead that fizzled out was another heartbreak. The case became one of those haunting mysteries, unsolved but never forgotten. When Tanya and Jay didn't return home, their families immediately raised the alarm. The abandoned bronze Ford van in Bellingham was the first major clue, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why was it left there? Where were Tanya and Jay? Investigators from Washington State and British Columbia worked together, retracing the couple's route. They checked ferry records, spoke with witnesses, and tried to piece together their movements. A few people reported seeing the van in different locations, but nothing concrete tied those sightings to what happened. Inside the van, Tanya's belongings were found, including her wallet and ID. That suggested she had been with the vehicle until fairly late in the trip. But Jay's items weren't there, which puzzled investigators. At first, investigators considered a range of possibilities. Could the couple have run into mechanical trouble? Had they crossed paths with someone who offered help but had other intentions? Or was there a chance they had simply gotten lost? The problem was that none of those theories had solid evidence behind them. The trail was frustratingly thin, and every lead seemed to fade as quickly as it appeared. It's important to remember the context here. This was 1987. Forensic science was nowhere near what it is today. DNA testing was in its infancy, and the idea of using genetic genealogy to track down suspects was decades away. Investigators collected what evidence they could, fingerprints, fibers, and other physical clues, but nothing could definitively point to a person. They had fragments of a story, but not enough to build the full picture. Over the years, tips trickled in. Some were promising at first glance, but they didn't pan out. Others were vague or impossible to verify. Each time, families and investigators hoped for a breakthrough, only to be disappointed. The case grew colder with each passing year. Files were stored, evidence was preserved, but the mystery remained. Tanya and Jay's families were left in limbo, grieving but without closure. For Tanya's parents and Jay's family, the waiting was unbearable. Imagine living with unanswered questions for decades. Every anniversary brought renewed pain. Every lead that fizzled was another heartbreak. The case became one of those haunting mysteries, unsolved but never forgotten. It lingered in the background of community memory, whispered about but never resolved. For more than 30 years, Tanya and Jay's families lived with unanswered questions. The case files sat in storage, the evidence carefully preserved, but the mystery remained. And then science caught up. By the late 2010s, DNA technology had advanced in ways no one could have imagined back in the late 80s. What once required large samples and produced limited results had become precise, powerful, and far-reaching. Investigators began revisiting old cases, asking, could modern science finally unlock the secrets hidden in decades-old evidence? One of the biggest game changers was genetic genealogy. You've probably heard of it in everyday life. People sending off saliva samples to companies like Ancestry or 23andMe to learn about their heritage or connect with distant relatives. But law enforcement realized this same technology could be used to identify unknown individuals in criminal cases. Here's how it worked. Investigators could take DNA evidence from a case, upload it to public genealogy databases, and look for partial matches. These weren't direct hits, but rather relatives, second cousins, third cousins, sometimes even more distant. From there, genealogists could build family trees, narrowing down the possibilities until they landed on a likely candidate. It was also like solving a puzzle backwards. Instead of asking who left this DNA, investigators asked who could this DNA belong to based on the family connections we can trace. In 2018, investigators decided to apply this new approach to the evidence preserved from Tanya and Jay's case. They uploaded the DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database. And almost immediately, they got hits. Relatives who had submitted their own DNA for ancestry purposes. From those matches, genealogists began building out family trees. It was painstaking work, but slowly the branches narrowed. One name began to stand out, William Earl Talbot II, a truck driver from Washington State. For Tanya and Jay's family, this was the moment they had been waiting decades for. After years of silence, there was finally a name. Finally, someone connected to the evidence. Investigators followed up, collecting a fresh DNA sample from Talbot. When they compared it to the evidence from 1987, it matched. After more than 30 years, the mystery had a resolution. Imagine the weight of that moment. For Tanya's parents, for Jay's family, for everyone who had carried the story in their hearts for decades. It was overwhelming. Closure doesn't erase grief, but it does bring answers, and answers matter. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about honoring Tanya and Jay, about giving their families the truth they deserved, and about showing that persistence in science can finally bring light to even the darkest mysteries. Once investigators identified William Earl Talbot II through genetic genealogy, the case moved into the courtroom. In 2018, Talbot was arrested, and prosecutors prepared to present decades of preserved evidence alongside the new DNA match. The trial was closely watched, not only because it involved Tanya and Jay's families finally hearing answers, but also because it was one of the first times genetic genealogy had been used to identify a suspect in such a high-profile cold case. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the preserved DNA evidence, and the genealogical work that led them to Talbot. Defense attorneys questioned the reliability of this new investigative method, but the science held strong. In 2019, Talbot was found guilty. For Tanya and Jay's family, it was a moment of both relief and heartbreak. Relief that the truth had finally come to light, heartbreak that it had taken so long, and that nothing could bring their loved ones back. For Tanya's parents, the verdict was bittersweet. They had lived with unanswered questions for more than 3 decades. To finally hear a name, to finally see accountability, it mattered. Tanya's father spoke about how the verdict gave them a measure of peace, even though the loss would always remain. Jay's family echoed those sentiments. Closure doesn't erase grief, but it does bring a kind of stillness. The endless wondering, the what ifs, the sleepless nights, all of that had an answer now. Their reactions were deeply human. Gratitude for the investigators who never gave up, appreciation for the science that made the breakthrough possible, and a quiet acknowledgement that Tanya and Jay's story had finally reached resolution. The conviction in Tanya and Jay's case wasn't just a resolution for 2 families. It became a turning point in how investigators everywhere thought about unsolved mysteries. For decades, cold cases were seen as heartbreaking but often hopeless. Families would cling to the idea that maybe someday something would change, but the reality was that many cases sat untouched in dusty file rooms. Then came the breakthrough in genetic genealogy. The Golden State Killer case in California had already shown the world what was possible. And when Tanya and Jay's case was solved using the same technique, it confirmed that this wasn't a one-off miracle. It was a new investigative tool with real staying power. Law enforcement agencies across North America began revisiting their cold case files. Evidence that had been preserved for decades suddenly had new potential. DNA samples that once seemed too small or too degraded could now be analyzed with far greater precision. For families who had lived with unanswered questions, this shift was monumental. Imagine being told for years that there was nothing more investigators could do, and then suddenly hearing, "We have new technology. We're reopening your loved one's case." That's what Tanya and Jay's story gave to countless families, a sense of hope. It showed that persistence mattered, that science could evolve, and that closure was still possible even after decades of silence. Of course, this ripple effect also sparked important conversations. Using genealogy databases raised questions about privacy, consent, and how far investigators should go in searching family connections. Some people worried about their DNA being used in ways they hadn't anticipated. But for many, the balance tilted towards justice. Tanya and Jay's case became part of a larger debate. How do we honor both privacy and the need to solve long-standing mysteries? The ripple effect of this case is still felt today. It's not just about one conviction, it's about a shift in mindset. Investigators now see cold cases not as closed doors, but as puzzles waiting for the right tools. Families see hope where there was once only grief, and society sees the power of science not just as data, but as a way to bring peace to those who have waited far too long. The promise was clear. Science could bring closure, accountability, and peace. Tanya and Jay's case became a symbol of that promise. But with that promise came questions. Genetic genealogy relies on public databases, places where everyday people upload their DNA to learn about their ancestry or connect with relatives. When investigators began using those databases, some people worried, what does that mean for my privacy? The debate centered on consent. Did people realize their DNA could be used in criminal investigations when they uploaded it? Should law enforcement have access to those databases without explicit permission? These weren't easy questions, and Tanya and Jay's case became part of that larger conversation. For many, the balance tilted towards justice. Families like Tanya's and Jay's deserved answers. Community deserved closure. And if science could provide that, wasn't it worth the trade-off? Others argued that safeguards were needed. Clear rules, transparency, and limits on how DNA could be used. The goal was to ensure that justice didn't come at the expense of individual rights. What's remarkable is that Tanya and Jay's case didn't just solve a mystery, it helped shape policy. It pushed lawmakers, scientists, and the public to think about how genetic genealogy should be used. It highlighted both the power and the responsibility that comes with new technology. At the heart of all these conversations were families. For Tanya's parents, for Jay's loved ones, the ethical debates were important. But the answers mattered most. They had waited decades for closure, and when science finally gave them that, it was life-changing. Their story reminds us that behind every debate, every policy, every scientific breakthrough, there are human lives. People who grieve, people who hope, and people who deserve the truth. At the heart of this entire story are two young people, Tanya van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook. They weren't celebrities, they weren't chasing headlines. They were simply living their lives, making plans, and sharing a journey together. Their story reminds us that behind every case file, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom verdict are human lives. Tanya's love of photography, Jay's dependable nature, their family's devotion, those are all details that matter. Those are the reasons why investigators never gave up, why science kept pushing forward, and why their case became a landmark moment. For Tanya's parents and Jay's family, the resolution brought a measure of peace. It didn't erase the grief, but it ended the endless wondering. After decades of silence, they finally had answers. Their resilience, their patience, and their courage in the face of uncertainty are a testament to the human spirit. And for communities on both sides of the border, the case became a reminder of persistence. That even when years pass, even when hope feels distant, breakthroughs are possible. From an investigative standpoint, Tanya and Jay's case is a masterclass in persistence and innovation. It shows the importance of preserving evidence even when technology hasn't caught up yet. It highlights the value of collaboration. Canadian and American authorities work together across borders, and it demonstrates how science can transform cold cases into solvable puzzles. For investigators today, the lesson is clear. Never assume a case is beyond reach. Technology evolves, methods improve, and what seems impossible today may be solvable tomorrow. For those of us who share these stories, whether through podcasts, documentaries, or articles, Tanya and Jay's case is a reminder of responsibility. True crime storytelling isn't just about mystery, it's about people. It's about honoring lives, respecting families, and presenting stories with clarity and compassion. Their case also shows the importance of context. It's not just about the breakthrough. It's about the decades of waiting, the emotional toll, and the ripple effect that changed how society thinks about justice and science. The legacy of Tanya and Jay is twofold. On a personal level, their families finally found closure. On a broader level, their case helped usher in a new era of cold case investigations, inspiring hope for countless other families. It's a legacy of persistence, innovation, and compassion, a reminder that science is not just about data, it's about people, and a testament to the idea that even after decades, truth can still be found. So when we look back at Tanya and Jay's story, we see more than just a solved case. We see love, loss, resilience, and the power of science to bring answers. We see families who never stopped hoping, investigators who never stopped working, and a breakthrough that changed the landscape of cold case investigations everywhere. Their story is a reminder that justice may take time, but it is never out of reach, and that even in the darkest mysteries, light can still break through. What do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening to Crime Time 911. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your gut.